They say that in the Iron Claw Kingdom, weakness is the only sin. Alpha King Torian Blackwood built his throne on the bones of the weak, preaching that biology is destiny. Wolves are predators, humans are cattle, and the natural order must never be broken. He spent a decade warring against the human hunters, wiping them out until he believed the threat was gone. He believed he was the apex of the food chain. So, when the fates played a cruel trick and tethered his soul to a fragile human barmaid in a border town, Torian laughed. He didn't see a queen. He saw a joke. He saw a soft, trembling creature wiping tables, unworthy of his bloodline. He kidnapped her, not to love her, but to make an example of her. He planned to drag her to his arena of bones and show his pack that even the mate bond could be crushed by a strong will. He thought she was trembling with fear. He didn't know she was trembling with the effort of holding herself back. He didn't know that the fragile girl he threw over his saddle was Sera, the retired commander of the Viper mercenaries. He didn't know that she had undergone the Hydra Ritual, drinking venom that burned her nerves away and replaced them with lightning reflexes. The king thinks he caught a rabbit. He is about to learn, in front of his entire army, that he actually caught a cobra by the tail. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Nova Blood Moon, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The town of Oak Haven was burning. It wasn't a war. It was a cull. The Iron Claw pack had descended on the border settlement at dusk, moving like a tidal wave of fur and steel. They were looking for rebels, human sympathizers who had been smuggling silver weapons across the border, but mostly they were there to remind the humans who owned the night. Alpha King Torian Blackwood rode through the center of the main street on a massive black war horse that was bred for trampling. He didn't need to shift. His mere presence, clad in armor made of dark iron and wolf pelts, was enough to send the villagers scrambling into their root cellars. The air smelled of thatched smoke, horse sweat, and the sharp copper tang of blood. To Torian, it smelled like order. "Clear the granaries!" Torian bellowed, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "If they hide rebels, they starve with them." Beside him, Beta Garrick laughed. Garrick was a brute of a wolf, scar-faced and cruel, swinging a heavy flail that cracked the cobblestones with every strike. "Too easy, my king," Garrick sneered, kicking open the door of a bakery. "These sheep don't even have teeth. We should just burn the whole nest and be done with it." "We need the taxes, Garrick," Torian replied coldly, watching a family flee into the woods. "Dead sheep produce no wool. We just shear them close enough to draw blood." Torian turned his horse, intending to ride toward the mayor's house to demand the surrender of the rebel leaders. He felt nothing for the destruction around him. Empathy was a defect. In the Iron Claw philosophy, if you couldn't defend your home, you didn't deserve to keep it. Then it hit him. It wasn't an arrow or a blade. It was a scent. It slammed into Torian's chest with the force of a battering ram, knocking the air from his lungs. It was faint, buried under the stench of smoke and fear, but it was undeniable. Vanilla, old books, and ozone. The scent of the fates, the scent of a mate. Torian pulled his horse up so sharply the beast reared, pawing at the smoke-choked air. His wolf, The primal beast inside him woke up and howled, a sound of pure, possessive ecstasy. Mate. Mine. Find. My king? Garrick asked, seeing Torian freeze. Is there a sniper? Torian didn't answer. He couldn't. He was being dragged by an invisible chain. He spurred his horse, ignoring the mayor's house, and galloped toward the source of the scent. He wove through the burning streets, his heart hammering a rhythm he had never felt before. A mate. The moon goddess had finally blessed him. He imagined her, a warrior she-wolf, strong enough to bear his pups, fierce enough to rule by his side, a queen of iron. He pulled up in front of a dilapidated structure at the edge of town. A sign swung on one hinge, the Rusty Nail. It was a tavern, a human tavern. Torian frowned. Why would a she-wolf be in a human dive bar? Perhaps she was a spy, a warrior in disguise? He dismounted, his heavy boots hitting the mud. He drew his sword, kicking the door open with enough force to shatter the latch. "Where is she?" Torian roared, stepping into the dim, smoky interior. The tavern was chaos. Patrons were overturning tables to hide. The barkeep was cowering behind a barrel. But Torian ignored them. His eyes, glowing a luminous alpha gold, scanned the room, hunting for the source of the scent. His gaze landed on the bar, and his heart stopped. There was no warrior she-wolf. There was no Amazonian queen. Standing behind the scarred wooden counter, calmly wiping a glass with a dirty rag, was a human girl. She was small, painfully small. She wore a stained brown dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was a mousy, nondescript brown, pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like she would break if a stiff wind hit her. But the scent, vanilla and ozone, was rolling off her in waves. Torian stood frozen in the doorway, the fire from the street framing his massive silhouette. His wolf was confused. It was whining, wanting to run to her, to lick her face. But Torian's rational mind was recoiling in horror. "A human?" Torian whispered, the words tasting like bile. "Fate has paired the king of beasts with a drink server?" The girl looked up. Sera had heard the door shatter. She had heard the heavy boots. She knew exactly what stood in the doorway: an alpha prime. High testosterone, high aggression, maximum threat level. In a previous life, before she retired to this godforsaken backwater town, Sera would have calculated the intercept vector. She would have vaulted the bar, driven a throwing knife through the gap in his neck armor. The gorget was slightly loose on the left side, she noted, and severed his carotid artery before he could draw a second breath. She was the Viper. She was the woman who had slaughtered the Northern Rogue Pack single-handedly to avenge her brother. She moved faster than wolves. She thought faster than generals. But she was retired. She was tired of blood. And she knew that if she killed an Alpha King here, his entire army outside would raze the town to the ground to avenge him. Everyone she knew, Old Man Miller, the baker, the kids playing in the alley, would die. Play the part, she told herself. Be the prey. Sera widened her eyes. She dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor. She let her hands tremble, a calculated vibration of the muscles. "Please," she whispered, pitching her voice to a tremble, I don't have any money. Take the register." Torian marched to the bar. He loomed over her, 7 feet of armored rage. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His grip was bruising. Sera didn't flinch. She kept her breathing shallow, mimicking panic, while her mind automatically tracked the pulse point in his wrist. One twist, she thought. I could snap his radius and disarm him. She did nothing. She let him inspect her, like a piece of livestock. "Look at you," Torian sneered, disgust warring with the biological pull of the bond. "No fur, no claws, skin as thin as parchment. You are nothing." "I'm just a barmaid," Sera stammered, looking away. "You are my mate," Torian corrected, his voice a low growl that shook the bottles on the shelf. "The moon goddess has a sick sense of humor. She thinks to shackle the Iron Claw to a weakling." Sera blinked. "Mate? That complicated things. Wolves didn't kill their mates, but they certainly didn't let them go." "I don't understand," Sera said. "You don't have to understand," Torian snapped. "You just have to exist as a reminder of why biology is a lie." He grabbed her arm. He didn't ask her to come. He yanked her over the bar top. Sera let herself be pulled. She stumbled, intentionally catching her foot on a stool to look clumsy. Torian caught her, but roughly, hauling her against his chest plate. The metal was cold. "Garrick!" Torian shouted toward the door. The beta rushed in, his flail dripping with blood. "My king?" "We are leaving," Torian announced, dragging Sera toward the exit. "Burn the tavern. Leave no trace." "And the girl?" Garrick asked, eyeing Sera hungrily. "Snack for the road?" "She is a prisoner," Torian said, shoving Sera through the door into the muddy street. "She is coming back to the Citadel." Sera stumbled into the mud. The heat of the burning town hit her face. She saw her neighbors running. She saw the soldiers laughing. Burn the tavern. That was her home, her quiet life. Gone in a second because a wolf decided he owned her. A cold, hard knot of anger formed in Sera's stomach. It was the familiar sensation of the Hydra venom in her veins waking up. "Patience," she told the venom. "Not yet." Torian mounted his horse. He didn't offer her a hand. He grabbed her by the waist and hauled her up, throwing her over the saddle in front of him like a sack of grain. "Hold on, human," Torian growled in her ear, "or fall off and be trampled. I don't care which." He spurred the horse. The massive beast thundered down the main street, away from the burning tavern. Sera sat awkwardly in front of him, her head bowed, but her eyes were scanning the rooftops. She saw it before the king did. On the roof of the general store, a rogue rebel, a young boy Sera had served cider to yesterday, popped up. He had a crossbow. He was aiming directly at Torian's exposed throat. The angle was perfect. At this speed, Torian wouldn't see it until the bolt was in his windpipe. Sera had a choice. Let the king die. If he died, the pack would go into a frenzy. They would slaughter the town. Garrick, the sadist beta, would take command. He would be worse. Also, if Torian died while holding her, the horse would likely roll, and she would be crushed. Calculated risk, Sera thought. As the boy pulled the trigger, Sera didn't scream. She didn't point. She simply shifted her weight. She dug her elbow sharply into the horse's withers, right on a pressure point she knew from her cavalry days. The horse stumbled. It was a slight misstep, a dip of the front left shoulder. Thwip! The crossbow bolt whistled through the air. Instead of hitting Torian's throat, it sailed harmlessly over his shoulder, missing him by an inch. Torian jerked his head around. "Sniper!" He kicked the horse into a full gallop, racing out of range before the boy could reload. "Clumsy beast!" Torian cursed, smacking the horse's neck. "You almost cost me my head." He looked down at Sera. She was huddled against the saddle horn, looking terrified. "You're lucky, human," Torian sneered. "If I had died, my beta would have skinned you alive." Sera didn't look up. She kept her face hidden in her hands, pretending to sob. I'm so scared, she muffled into her palms. But under the cover of her hands, her expression was flat, dead calm. She hadn't saved him because she cared. She saved him because he was her ticket out of the massacre. And now she was going into the heart of the enemy's stronghold, the Citadel. Torian Blackwood thought he was bringing home a pet to mock. He didn't realize he was smuggling a bomb through his own front gates. "Enjoy your victory, King," Sera whispered, too low for his wolf hearing to catch over the wind. "You just invited the viper into your nest." The Ironclaw Citadel was not built for comfort, it was built for war. It rose from the jagged cliffs of the Blackwood Mountains like a fist of dark stone punching the sky. There were no gardens, no tapestries, no softness. The walls were lined with iron spikes, and the courtyard smelled of wet fur, forge smoke, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Sera rode into this fortress draped over the king's saddle like a hunting trophy. As Torian rode through the massive iron gates, the pack gathered. Hundreds of wolves, warriors, elders, pups, lined the courtyard. They cheered for their king, howling their victory over the burning town below. But as Torian slowed his horse and the crowd got a good look at his prize, the cheering died. It was replaced by a ripple of confusion, then laughter. "What is that?" a female warrior jeered, pointing a clawed finger at Sera. "Did the king bring back a snack?" "It's a human," another laughed. "Look how small she is. She'll break if you sneeze on her." Torian dismounted, his boots hitting the cobblestones with a heavy thud. He grabbed Sera by the waist and hauled her down, dropping her unceremoniously onto the hard ground. Sera stumbled, falling to her hands and knees. She felt the gravel dig into her skin. She stayed down. Submission, she reminded herself. Let them see the victim. "This," Torian announced, his voice booming across the courtyard, "is what the fates have sent to test us." He gestured to Sera, who was huddled in the dirt, shaking, though only because the mountain air was freezing and her dress was thin. "The moon goddess has tethered the Ironclaw to this thing," Torian spat. "A human, a weakling, a creature that survives only because we allow it." The crowd murmured. Disgust rolled off them in waves. A mate was supposed to be a partner, a force multiplier. This was a liability. "I bring her here not as a queen," Torian declared, raising his fist, "but as a prisoner. She will serve in the kennels. She will scrub the blood from our armor, and she will serve as a daily reminder that biology does not dictate the future of this pack. Strength does." The pack roared their approval. They liked that answer. It validated their cruelty. "Garrick," Torian commanded, "get her out of my sight. Put her in the armory. Make her useful." Beta Garrick stepped forward, grinning. His yellow eyes tracked over Sera's small frame with sadistic glee. "Up, rat," Garrick growled. He kicked her in the ribs, not enough to break bone, but enough to bruise. Sera gasped, clutching her side. The Hydra venom in her veins spiked, flooding her system with adrenaline. Her vision sharpened. She saw the opening. Garrick was top-heavy. A simple sweep of the leg would shatter his ankle. She exhaled slowly, forcing the venom down. Not yet. She scrambled to her feet, keeping her head lowered. "Yes, sir. Please don't hurt me." Garrick laughed, grabbing her by the back of her dress and dragging her toward the dark maw of the keep. "Oh, we haven't even started hurting you yet." "Sweetheart." The armory of the Ironclaw was a cavernous hall in the belly of the castle. It was hot. smelling of oil and grinding wheels. Weapons of every shape and size lined the walls, great swords, flails, morning stars, and the heavy iron spears the pack favored for hunting large game. Garrick shoved Sera into the room. She tripped over a pile of chainmail, landing hard on the flagstones. "Clean," Garrick ordered. He pointed to a massive pile of weapons in the corner. They were caked with dried blood and gore from the raid on Oak Haven. Every speck of rust, every drop of blood. If I find a single smudge, you lose a finger. He tossed a rag and a bucket of oil at her. The bucket hit her shoulder, splashing cold oil onto her dress. "And don't try to run," Garrick whispered, leaning down so his breath, hot and smelling of rotting meat, washed over her face. "The corridors are patrolled by wolves who haven't eaten in 2 days. They'd love a chew toy." Garrick turned and marched out, slamming the heavy oak door. The lock clicked. Sera was alone. She waited 10 seconds. She listened to Garrick's footsteps fading down the hall. Then she stood up. The trembling vanished. Her posture changed instantly. Her spine straightened, her shoulders rolled back. The terrified barmaid was gone. The viper was present. Sera scanned the room, one exit. Reinforced oak, no windows. Ventilation shaft in the north corner, too small for a wolf, big enough for me, but likely grated. She walked over to the pile of dirty weapons. She needed to know what she was dealing with. If she had to fight her way out, she needed a tool. She reached down and picked up a claymore. It was a massive two-handed sword forged from black iron. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. For a normal human woman of her size, lifting it would be a struggle. Swinging it would be impossible. Sera picked it up with one hand. Her muscles, condensed and altered by the alchemical venom she had ingested years ago, didn't strain. She held the massive blade out horizontally, her arm perfectly steady. She frowned. "Balance is off," she whispered to the empty room. "Pommel is too light for the blade length. Amateur smithing." She spun the heavy sword in her hand, a fluid, dazzling rotation that blurred the air. She tested the edge with her thumb. Dull. She set it down and picked up a spear. Iron shaft, leaf-shaped head. Good penetration, but heavy. She moved through the pile, cataloging the arsenal. She wasn't cleaning, she was shopping. She needed to know the weight ratios of their steel. If she ended up in a fight, she needed to know exactly how much force was required to snap these weapons. She picked up the claymore again. She placed the flat of the blade on the tip of her index finger. She closed her eyes, feeling the center of gravity. She adjusted her finger by a millimeter. The massive 40-pound sword hung there, perfectly balanced on one finger, defying physics. It was a meditation exercise she used to do before a kill. Find the balance, find the fulcrum, find the weak point. "You have strong wrists for a barmaid." The voice came from the shadows in the corner of the room. Sera froze. She didn't drop the sword. That would be a novice mistake, startling and losing control. Instead, she slowly, deliberately grabbed the hilt with her other hand and lowered the weapon to the table. She turned around. An old wolf sat in the shadows on a crate. He had gray fur sprouting from his ears and a face like a crumpled map. He was holding a whetstone, which he had stopped using. This was Elder Kale, the pack historian, the one wolf who watched rather than barked. Sera's mind raced. He saw me balance a 40-pound sword on one finger. Sera stammered, pitching her voice back into the high, frightened register. "I scrub floors, sir, carrying water buckets. It builds muscle." Kyle stared at her. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but sharp with intelligence. He stood up slowly, leaning on a cane. He walked over to the table. He looked at the claymore. He looked at Sera's thin arms. "Water buckets," Kale repeated. "Must be heavy buckets." He reached out and touched the sword. This blade was forged by the giants of the Frost Reach. It takes an alpha in full shift to wield it properly. And yet, you spun it. "I dropped it," Sera lied, stepping back, hunching her shoulders to look smaller. "I was trying to move it to clean it, and it slipped." Kale chuckled. It was a dry, rasping sound. "You lie well, girl. Your scent didn't spike. Your heart rate didn't jump." He leaned in close, sniffing the air. "You smell like vanilla and ozone. The king's scent marks you. But underneath that, there is something else, something chemical, something cold." Sera met his gaze. For a split second, she considered snapping his neck. He was old, fragile. It would take less than a second. But killing an elder would bring the whole pack down on her before she had an exit strategy. "I'm just a human," Sera whispered. "I'm nobody." Kyle held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "Perhaps," Kale said softly. "Or perhaps the king has brought a wolf in sheep's clothing into his den. Be careful, girl. Torian is arrogant, but he is not blind. If he sees what I just saw, he will kill you out of fear." Kale turned and shuffled out of the armory, leaving Sera alone with the smell of oil and the pounding of her own heart. He knew, or at least he suspected. The clock was ticking. Night fell over the Citadel. The temperature dropped, turning the stone fortress into an icebox. Sera sat on the cold floor, scrubbing the last of the blood from a pile of daggers. Her hands were black with grease, her dress ruined. She was hungry, thirsty, and cold. The door handle turned. Sera instantly dropped into her crouch, head bowed, scrubbing furiously. The door opened. King Torian filled the frame. He wasn't wearing his armor now. He wore a tunic of black velvet that did little to hide the massive corded muscle of his chest and arms. He held a goblet of wine in one hand. He looked at her. He expected to see her crying. He expected to see her curled in a ball, broken by the cruelty of the beta and the isolation. Instead, Sera looked up. Her face was dirty, yes, but her eyes were dry. Torian frowned. He stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The mate bond flared in his chest. A sudden, desperate urge to pull her into his arms and warm her. He shoved the feeling down violently. "You aren't weeping," Torian observed, his voice hard. "Would it please you if I did?" Sera asked quietly. "It would be natural," Torian said, pacing around her. "You are a human female, alone in a castle of predators. You have been beaten, starved, and locked in a dungeon. You should be hysterical." He stopped in front of her, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "Why aren't you hysterical, Sera?" He said her name for the first time. It felt strange in his mouth. Sera looked at him. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the gold of his wolf warring with the arrogance of the king. "I grew up in the borderlands, my king," Sera said, keeping her voice neutral. "I've seen wolves before. I've seen raids. Tears don't put out fires. They just waste water." Torian narrowed his eyes. "You speak boldly for a prisoner." "I speak the truth." Torian reached out. He grabbed her hand, the hand that was holding the rag. He squeezed. He wanted to feel her bones shift. He wanted to feel her frailty. "I could crush this hand," Torian whispered. "I could cripple you right now. You would never wipe another table." Sera didn't pull away. She didn't gasp. She looked at his hand crushing hers. She knew that with a simple engagement of her venom-enhanced tendons, she could resist him. She could probably break his thumb. But she let her hand go limp. "You could," Sera agreed calmly. "But why?" "Because you are weak," Torian roared, standing up and flinging her hand away. "Because every time I look at you, I feel this sickness, this pull, and I hate it." He threw his goblet against the wall. Red wine splashed across the weapons like fresh blood. "My pack looks at me and sees a king tethered to a corpse," Torian snarled. "They wonder if my blood is tainted. They wonder if I will go soft." He glared at her. "I need to prove them wrong. I need to prove that I am not ruled by fate." Sera watched him tantrum. It was pathetic. He was a boy in a man's body, terrified of his own feelings. "So what will you do?" Sera asked, her voice bordering on bored. "Kill me?" "No," Torian smiled cruelly. "Death is too easy, and the bond would drive me mad if I killed you myself." He walked to the door. "Tomorrow," Torian announced, "we go to the Arena of Bones. I have called a gathering. Every wolf in the Citadel will be there." Sera felt a prickle of warning on the back of her neck. "Why?" "For a demonstration," Torian said, opening the door. "I told Garrick to prepare a show. We are going to show the pack exactly how fragile a human really is. We are going to make you run, Sera. We are going to make you scream. And when you are cowering in the dirt, begging for your life, only then will I reject you." He looked back at her one last time. "Sleep well, little mouse. Tomorrow the cats come out to play." The door slammed. The lock clicked. Sera sat in the silence. She looked at the wine dripping down the wall. "A demonstration," she whispered to herself. She slowly stood up. She rotated her shoulder, feeling the satisfying pop of the joint. She flexed her fingers. She walked over to the pile of weapons she had cleaned. She picked up a small jagged piece of scrap metal. A broken dagger tip she had hidden under a rag earlier. She slid it into the hem of her boot. Torian wanted a show. He wanted to prove that humans were weak. He wanted to break her in the Arena of Bones. Sera smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of the viper, seeing the mouse walk into the trap. "You want to see what a human can do, Torian?" she murmured. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. "Be careful what you wish for." The Arena of Bones lived up to its name. It was a natural amphitheater carved into the base of the mountain, a deep, circular pit surrounded by tiers of jagged stone seats. The floor of the arena was not dirt. It was a mixture of gray sand and the pulverized remains of centuries of challengers who had failed to prove their worth. Today, the arena was packed. Every wolf in the Iron Claw Citadel was there. Warriors sharpened their blades in the front rows. Mothers held their pups in the upper tiers. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, roasting meat, and the electric anticipation of violence. They had come to see the king reject his mate. They had come to see the weakness of humanity exposed. Sera stood in the center of the pit. The sun beat down on her, bright and unforgiving. She still wore her stained tavern dress, the hem torn and muddy. Her hair hung loose around her face, shielding her eyes from the jeering crowd. She looked small. From the top tier, she must have looked like a doll dropped in a lion's den. Across the arena, on a raised dais carved from black obsidian, King Torian sat on his throne. He wore his full ceremonial armor, a cape of black wolf fur cascading over his shoulders. He looked magnificent. He looked invincible. But his hand gripped the armrest of his throne tight enough to crack the stone. "Citizens of the Iron Claw," Torian's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the pit. The crowd fell silent instantly. "For generations," Torian continued, standing up and walking to the edge of the dais, "we have fought to keep our blood pure. We have fought to prove that the wolf is the apex predator, that we are the rightful rulers of this land." He pointed a gauntleted finger down at Sera. "And yet, fate mocks us. Fate has tied my soul to this." The crowd laughed. It was a cruel barking sound. "Look at her!" Torian shouted, feeding off their energy, trying to drown out the voice in his head that whispered, "She is yours." No claws to hunt, no fur to endure the winter, no teeth to defend or kill, just soft skin and hollow bones. Sera stood motionless. She kept her head down. She was listening to his heartbeat. She was counting the pulse of the crowd, heart rate of the king, 110, elevated, stress, heart rate of the beta, 85, calm, predatory. Beta Garrick stood 10 paces away from her in the sand. He was stripped to the waist, revealing a torso scarred by 100 battles. He held a training whip in one hand, but his eyes were fixed on the rack of real weapons near the arena wall. "We do not bow to fate," Torian roared. "We bow to strength, and today I will show you that this creature is not worthy of the Iron Claw. I will show you that she is nothing but prey." He looked down at Garrick. "Beta," Torian commanded, "make her run. Show them how a human cowers." Garrick grinned. He cracked the whip. The sound was like a gunshot. "Run, little mouse," Garrick taunted, taking a step toward her. "Run, and maybe I won't take a piece of your ear." Sera didn't move. She didn't flinch at the crack of the whip. She just stood there, staring at the sand. "I said run," Garrick shouted, snapping the whip again. This time, the tip lashed out, slicing the air inches from Sera's cheek. The crowd cheered. "Make her bleed! Make her squeal!" Sera looked up. For the first time, she looked Garrick in the eye. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the bowl of the arena, it carried. The crowd went quiet, confused. Humans didn't say no. Humans ran. Garrick's smile faltered. He felt a flicker of annoyance. He was being upstaged by a barmaid. "You don't say no to me, rat," Garrick growled. He dropped the whip. "You want to play hard? Fine." He walked over to the weapon rack. He bypassed the wooden training staves. He bypassed the blunted swords. He reached for the war spear. It was a heavy, ugly weapon. A 6-foot shaft of solid iron, tipped with a razor-sharp triangular head, designed to pierce plate armor. It weighed 20 pounds. In the hands of an alpha, it was a missile capable of punching through a brick wall. Garrick hefted the spear. He turned back to Sera. Up on the dais, Torian frowned. "Garrick, just scare her. Don't kill her." But Garrick wasn't listening. The bloodlust had taken him. He saw the defiance in Sera's eyes, and his wolf demanded submission. "Dance, human," Garrick hissed. He pulled his arm back. His muscles bulged. He channeled his full alpha strength into the throw. He didn't aim for her feet. He didn't aim for her shoulder. He aimed directly at her head. "No!" Torian screamed, jumping up from his throne. It was too late. Garrick launched the spear. The iron weapon left his hand with a sonic whoosh. It flew across the 20 yards separating them at over 100 miles per hour. It was a blur of gray death. The crowd gasped. They expected to see the girl's head explode like a melon. They expected pink mist. Sera watched the spear leave Garrick's hand. Inside her body, the dormant Hydra venom ignited. Adrenal dump, sensory dilation, initiate. The world didn't stop, but it slowed down. The roar of the crowd became a low drone. The flying spear ceased to be a blur. It became a distinct object. She could see the rust on the iron shaft. She could see the rotation of the flight. Trajectory, cranial impact. Velocity, 140 feet per second. Mass, 20 pounds. Solution, intercept. Sera didn't run. She didn't dodge. She planted her feet. She rotated her hips, grounding herself into the sand. She raised her left hand. To the crowd, it happened in a blink. 1 second, the spear was flying. The next, there was a sound. Thwack! It wasn't the wet, crunching sound of metal hitting bone. It was the sharp, ringing crack of meat hitting iron. Dust puffed up around Sera's feet. Silence slammed into the arena. Absolute, suffocating silence. The dust settled. Sera was still standing. Her left arm was extended. Her hand was wrapped around the iron shaft of the spear. The tip, the deadly razor-sharp point, was stopped 2 inches from her nose. She hadn't moved, except for her feet. The kinetic force of the catch had been so immense that it had pushed her backward. Her boots had plowed 2 deep furrows in the sand, sliding 3 feet back, but she remained upright. She had caught a war spear thrown by an alpha wolf with one hand. Up on the dais, King Torian stood frozen, his hand outstretched as if to catch the weapon himself. His mouth was open. His eyes were wide, staring at the impossible sight. "By the goddess," Elder Kale whispered from the front row. In the arena, Garrick blinked. He looked at his empty hand. He looked at Sera. His brain couldn't process it. That spear should have taken her head off. Sera lowered the spear slowly. Her hand was smoking slightly. The friction of the iron against her skin had burned her palm, but the venom dulled the pain to a mere irritation. She looked at the spear tip. She looked at Garrick. Her eyes were no longer the frightened brown eyes of a barmaid. They were cold, flat, the eyes of a predator that had just decided to stop playing with its food. "You have poor form," Sera said. Her voice was calm, conversational, echoing strangely in the silent pit. "You over-rotated your shoulder. It pulled your aim to the left." What are you?" Garrick stammered, taking a step back. Sera didn't answer. She looked down at the iron shaft in her hand. "Solid iron," she murmured. "Crude, but effective." She shifted her grip. She placed the shaft across her thigh. She raised her leg and brought her hand down simultaneously. Crack! The sound was like a thunderclap. The solid iron shaft snapped in half. The crowd flinched. Wolves whimpered. Iron did not snap. Iron bent. To snap cold iron required thousands of pounds of pressure. Sera dropped the 2 halves of the broken spear into the sand. Clunk, clunk. She looked at Garrick. "You missed," she whispered. Then she moved. She didn't run like a human. She didn't lope like a wolf. She moved like a striking snake. She crossed the 20 yards in a blur. Garrick, a battle-hardened alpha, barely had time to raise his hands. Sera didn't punch him. She didn't use a weapon. She leaped, driving her knee straight into his sternum. Crunch! The impact lifted the 300-pound beta off his feet. His ribs collapsed inward. He flew backward, crashing into the stone wall of the arena with enough force to crack the masonry. He slid down the wall, gasping, blood bubbling from his lips. He tried to stand, his wolf instincts screaming at him to fight. Sera was already there. She grabbed him by the throat with one hand and slammed him back against the wall. She lifted him until his feet dangled 6 inches off the ground. Garrick clawed at her arm. His claws tore her dress, raked her skin. She didn't even blink. She squeezed. Garrick's eyes bulged. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't shift. The pressure on his windpipe was absolute. He was staring into the face of a human girl, and he saw death. "You wanted to see me run," Sera said softly, leaning in close so only he in the front row could hear. "You wanted to see me scream." She tightened her grip. Garrick's vision started to go black. "I don't run from dogs, Garrick. I put them down." "Sera, stop!" The roar came from the dais. King Torian vaulted over the railing, dropping 15 feet into the arena sand. He landed in a crouch, claws extended, his alpha aura flaring like a supernova. He charged at her. "Release him!" Sera sensed the king coming. She felt the displacement of air. She didn't let go of Garrick. She simply turned her head to look at Torian. "One more step, Your Majesty," Sera said coolly, "and your beta loses his larynx." Torian skid to a halt 10 feet away. He looked at his beta, dangling limp and blue-faced in the grip of the barmaid. He looked at the broken spear in the sand. He looked at Sera. And for the first time, he didn't see a weak human. He saw the scars on her arms, visible now through the torn sleeves of her dress. Small, circular scars, puncture marks. Hundreds of them. Torian's blood ran cold. He knew those marks. They were myths. Bedtime stories told to scare pups. "The marks," Torian whispered, his voice shaking. "Hydra venom. You survived the ritual." Sera smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was terrifying. "Survived it?" she asked. She tossed Garrick aside like a sack of trash. The beta hit the ground, unconscious, wheezing for air. Sera wiped her hands on her dress. She turned to face the king and the silent, terrified army watching from the stands. "I mastered it." She ripped the tattered remains of her sleeves off, revealing the intricate web of scars running up both arms, the chemical burns of a hunter who had turned herself into a living weapon. "You brought me here to mock me, Torian," Sera announced, her voice ringing with authority. "You told your pack I was weak. You told them I was nothing." She walked toward the weapon rack. She picked up a heavy broadsword. She spun it in her hand, the blade singing. "Well, here I am," she said, pointing the sword at the king. "I'm ready for the demonstration. Who's next?" No one moved. Not a single wolf dared to breathe. The Alpha King stood in the sand, staring at his fated mate. Realizing that the predator he had been hunting for a decade was standing right in front of him, and she was pissed off. The silence in the arena of bones was heavy enough to crush a man's chest. Thousands of wolves, apex predators who prided themselves on noise and violence, were struck dumb. They stared down into the pit where their beta lay broken against the wall and where their king stood facing a human woman who held a broadsword as if she had been born with it in her hand. King Torian Blackwood looked at the scars on Sera's arms. They were distinct, rhythmic patterns of white tissue, puncture marks where heavy needles had injected the alchemical venom directly into the bone marrow. He knew the stories. Every wolf did. The hunters had a sect of fanatics who believed that to fight monsters, one had to become a monster. They drank the blood of the Hydra, a toxic cocktail of neurotoxins and stimulants. 9 out of 10 died screaming as their nervous systems liquefied. The one who survived became something else, faster, stronger, deadlier. "The Viper," Torian whispered. The name tasted like ash. You are the ghost of the North. Sera didn't lower the sword. She stood with her weight perfectly distributed, her eyes tracking the king's every micro-movement. "That was the name the Northern Rogue Pack gave me," Sera said, her voice carrying clearly to the upper tiers. "Right before I slaughtered them." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The Northern Rogues had been a plague, a massive cannibalistic pack that had terrorized the borderlands for years. Then, overnight, they had vanished. Their den was found filled with bodies, killed not by claws, but by steel. "You killed Alpha Varg," Torian said, realization dawning on him. "I thought it was a rival pack. I thought no human could take him." "Varg was slow," Sera said dismissively. "He relied on his size. He thought that because I had no fur, I had no teeth." She took a step forward, the tip of her broadsword tracing a line in the sand. "Just like you, Torian." Torian felt the humiliation burn his face. He looked up at his pack. They were watching him. They were waiting to see if their alpha was stronger than the human legend. If he backed down now, his reign was over. The Iron Claw did not follow cowards. "You think this changes anything?" Torian growled, letting his alpha aura flare. The air around him shimmered with heat. "You are still in my territory. You are surrounded by 5,000 wolves. You may be fast, Viper, but you cannot kill us all." "I don't have to kill them all," Sera replied calmly. "I just have to kill the king. The rest will scatter." She raised the sword, pointing it at his throat. "You wanted a demonstration of strength, Torian? Draw your blade." Torian roared. It was a sound of pure primal frustration. He drew his massive greatsword, a slab of black iron named Widowmaker. He charged. To the wolves in the stands, Torian was a blur of power. He was an Alpha Prime, the fastest of his kind. His strike was designed to cleave a man in two from shoulder to hip. But to Sera, with the Hydra venom singing in her veins, Torian was moving underwater. She watched his muscles bunch. She watched his weight shift to his back foot. She calculated the arc of his swing. Too wide, too emotional. Sera didn't block. Blocking an alpha's strike would shatter her bones, venom or not. Physics still applied. Instead, she flowed. She stepped inside his guard, slipping under the massive arc of his sword as his blade slammed harmlessly into the sand where she had been standing a fraction of a second ago. Sera drove the pommel of her sword into his solar plexus. Thud! The impact knocked the wind out of the king. He staggered back, gasping. Before he could recover, Sera spun. She swept his legs with a precise, devastating kick to the back of the knee. Torian fell. The Alpha King hit the dirt on one knee. He snarled, slashing upward with his sword in a desperate backhand. Sera parried. She caught his blade with hers, angling the steel so his strength worked against him. She slid her blade down his, the metal screeching, until her cross guard locked with his. She leaned in. They were face to face now, the Wolf King and the Hunter. "You talk about biology," Sera hissed, her brown eyes locking onto his gold ones. "You talk about purity, but look at you, kneeling." Torian roared and shoved her back. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning technique for pure savagery. He swung wildly, a storm of steel. Sera danced through the storm. She was a ghost. She dodged by inches, letting his blade whisk the hair from her face. She cut him, small, shallow cuts. A slice to the forearm, a nick on the cheek, a cut across the thigh. She wasn't trying to kill him, she was dissecting him. "This is for the tavern," Sera said, slicing his bicep. Torian grunted, switching his grip. "This is for the kidnapping," she said, spinning behind him and kicking him in the spine. Torian stumbled forward, nearly dropping his weapon. "And this," Sera said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she appeared in front of him again, "is for calling me weak?" She fainted high. Torian raised his sword to block. Sera dropped low. She drove her boot into his chest plate. At the same time, she lashed out with her sword hand, not with the blade, but with a disarming strike she had perfected over a decade of hunting. She struck his wrist bone with the heavy brass pommel of her sword. Crack! Torian shouted in pain. His fingers spasmed. The great sword Widowmaker fell from his grip and landed in the dust. Torian reached for it, but he was too slow. Sera stepped on the blade of his sword. She leveled the tip of her own sword at his throat. "Yield," Sera commanded. The arena was deathly silent. The only sound was Torian's ragged breathing. The king of the Iron Claw was on his back in the dirt. A human woman, a barmaid, stood over him with a sword at his jugular. Torian looked up at her. He saw the sweat on her brow. He saw the cold, hard focus in her eyes. And he felt something else, the mate bond. It wasn't screaming in anger anymore. It was humming with pride. His wolf wasn't ashamed. His wolf was howling in triumph. Strong. She is strong. She is queen. Torian realized with a sudden crushing clarity that he had been a fool. He had wanted a strong mate. He had searched the kingdoms for a warrior. And when fate handed him the deadliest warrior in the land, he had mocked her because she didn't have fur. "You," Torian wheezed, blood trickling from his lip, "you are magnificent." Sera blinked. She expected him to curse her. She expected him to order his archers to fire. "Don't," Sera warned, pressing the blade closer to his skin. "Don't try to charm me now, Torian. You wanted to break me. You failed." "I did," Torian admitted, his voice rough. He looked at the crowd. "I failed. I judged you by the skin you wear, not the fire you carry." He looked back at her. "Kill me then. Finish it. If you walk away, you leave an enemy. If you kill me, you become the Alpha." Sera looked at him. She looked at the exposed skin of his throat. One thrust. That was all it would take. She would be the queen of the Iron Claw. She would have an army. She would be safe forever. But she looked at the wolves in the stands. They were terrified. They were waiting for the slaughter. Sera remembered why she retired. She remembered the blood. She remembered the look in the eyes of the pups when she killed their fathers in the northern pack. She didn't want to be a queen of wolves. She just wanted to be left alone. Sera slowly pulled the sword back. She stepped off his blade. "I don't want your crown, Torian," Sera said quietly, "and I don't want your life. It's not worth the effort of cleaning my sword." She stabbed her sword into the sand next to his head. It stood there, quivering, a monument to his defeat. "I'm leaving," Sera announced. She turned her back on the king. "Wait!" Torian scrambled to sit up, clutching his bruised chest. "Sera, you can't just leave. The bond. We are fated." Sera stopped. She didn't turn around. "Fate made a suggestion, Torian," she said over her shoulder. "I'm rejecting it." She looked up at the tiers of wolves. "Move," she commanded. The crowd didn't hesitate. The wolves in the lower aisle scrambled over each other to get out of her way. They parted like the Red Sea. They looked at her with fear, yes, but also with something new. Respect. Sera walked toward the tunnel exit. Her arms ached. The venom crash was coming. Soon she would be shaking, her nerves on fire. She needed to get to the woods before she collapsed. "Sera!" Torian yelled, staggering to his feet. He ignored his sword. He ignored his beta, who was still unconscious by the wall. He ran a few steps after her, then stopped. He realized he couldn't stop her, not with force. He had tried force, and she had broken it over her knee. "I will find you!" Torian shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I will earn this. I will crawl if I have to. I will prove I am worthy of you." Sera paused at the mouth of the tunnel. The shadows embraced her. She looked back one last time. She saw the king of the Iron Claw, dusty, bleeding, and defeated, standing alone in the center of his arena. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked desperate. "Don't bother," Sera called back. "I prefer dogs that know how to sit." She vanished into the darkness. Torian stood there for a long time. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the ache in his bones and the hollow space in his chest where the bond pulled at him. Elder Kale hobbled down into the arena sand. He stopped beside the king. He looked at the sword Sera had left behind. "Well," the elder croaked, poking the sword with his cane, "that was certainly a demonstration." Torian looked at the elder. "She broke my beta. She defeated me. She walked out of my stronghold without a scratch." "Yes," Kyle agreed. "She is exactly what the prophecy promised. A queen of iron." Torian looked at the empty tunnel. A strange sensation filled his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was hunger. For the first time in his life, Torian Blackwood had met something he couldn't conquer. Something that made him feel small. And he knew, with the absolute certainty of an alpha, that he would not rest until she was back, not as a prisoner, not as a trophy, but as his equal. "Clear the arena," Torian commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Heal the beta. Rebuild the gate." He turned and walked toward the castle, limping slightly. "Where are you going, my king?" Kyle asked. Torian stopped. He looked at the mountain peaks in the distance where the woods began. "I have a tavern to rebuild," Torian said, "and a viper to catch.